Presidents of Iran, Russia and Turkey, who are the main outside players in Syria's long war, held a meeting in Tehran to discuss the fate of the rebel-held province of Idlib as rival factions prepared for what could be the conflict's last great battle. As the three leaders gathered in the Iranian capital on Friday, Russian and government warplanes hit rebel-held parts of Idlib. Iran's Hassan Rouhani demanded that the intervention of the United States in Syrian war should end. Rouhani said that any interference without cooperation with the Assad government will only deepen the Syrian crisis. Russian President Vladimir Putin remained against a ceasefire. Putin said the rebels were not part of the peace talks and that the Syrian government should regain control over all of its territory. Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan said his country does not want a bloodbath in Idlib province. He said a ceasefire would be an important step and an attack on Idlib would result in a massacre and a disaster. In a series of tweets following the summit, Erdogan has said that resorting to methods that would disregard civilian lives will only play into the hands of what he called terrorists. Britain's ambassador to the United Nations, Karen Pierce, on Friday named several Syrian generals and their units stationed around rebel-held Idlib province, warning in the Security Council that they would be punished for any major military offensive on civilians. Meanwhile, UN Syria envoy Staffan de Mistura warned the Security Council that there were all the ingredients for a perfect storm in Idlib and the United Nations was ready to work with all parties on evacuation routes if they were required. The UN World Food Programme is preparing for emergency food supplies as civilians in Syria's Idlib prepared for an expected army offensive against the last major stronghold of active opposition to President Bashar al-Assad's rule. About half of the people fled fighting or were transferred there by the government under surrender deals from other parts of Syria as Assad has steadily taken back territory. Scores of people gathered in Istanbul to protest a possible attack by Assad regime and its allies in Syria's northwestern province of Idlib. The protesters, including Syrians living in Istanbul, gathered after the Friday prayer outside the historic Faith Mosque on the city's European side. U.S. President Donald Trump called on the U.S. Justice Department to investigate the New York Times after the news outlet published a column this week by an anonymous administration official questioning his fitness for office. The New York Times issued a statement saying it was confident the Justice Department would not participate in what it calls a blatant abuse of government power. Trump also said he was considering taking action against the Times, whose shares moved briefly lower after his comments were made in public. An advisor to U.S. President Donald Trump's election campaign has been sentenced to jail for 14 days for lying to FBI agents over contacts with Russians that set off a federal probe into possible collusion with Moscow. District judge said that foreign policy specialist George Papadopoulos lied in an investigation that was important to national security. Former U.S. President Barack Obama returned to the campaign trail where he assailed President Donald Trump and Republicans, urging Democrats to deliver a vital check on the abuses of power. In an unusually blistering attack on his successor, Obama said Americans were living in dangerous times and accused Republicans of threatening democracy, dividing the country, undermining global alliances, and cozying up to Russia. Protesters stormed the Iranian consulate in Iraq's southern city of Basra, turning their wrath on Iraq's powerful neighbor. Demonstrators broke in and began damaging the offices, shouting condemnation of what many Iraqis perceive as Iraq's sway over Iraq's political parties. Security forces said that consulate was empty when the crowd burst in. One protester was killed and 11 more were wounded during demonstrations in Iraq's Basra as unrest continues in the city. Protesters attacked the offices of an Iran-backed Iraqi Shiite militia with fireworks and petrol bombs. The guards of the militia compound were also seen firing rifles to keep protesters back. Since Monday, 11 protesters have died and dozens more have been wounded, mostly in clashes with the security forces. Residents say that they have been driven to the streets by corruption and misrule that allowed infrastructure to collapse, leaving no power or safe drinking water in the heat of summer. Israeli troops killed one Palestinian at a weekly protest on the Gaza-Israel border. Palestinian health officials say a 17-year-old boy was shot dead by Israeli soldiers and the 10 others were wounded, 45 of them with live fire, including a medic. Protesters rolled burning tires and hurled stones towards the Israeli soldiers and the border fence. The Israeli military said that some threw fire bombs and a grenade. No Israelis have been hurt. An Israeli military statement said soldiers had used right dispersal means and acted in accordance with standard operating procedures. Israeli aircraft also struck two Hamas outposts. Supporters of Yemen's Houthi movement took to the streets protesting against a Saudi-led coalition, which they said had prevented the Houthi delegation from attending the United Nations-sponsored peace talks in Geneva. The Houthi-run Al Masra TV reported that the UN, which wants the government and the Houthi movement to work towards a deal to end the war, remove foreign forces from Yemen and establish a national unity government, could not secure required authorization from the coalition which controls Yemen's airspace. Libya reopened its only functioning airport in the capital, Tripoli, a week after it's closed because of fighting among rival groups. A truce brokered by the United Nations after a week of violence between local fighters has largely been observed. Residents of Tripoli emerged from their homes to take advantage of the ceasefire, and families could be seen spending leisure time in the capital's Martyrs Square. So several thousand far-right demonstrators gathered in the eastern German city of Chemnitz and for another evening of protest after the fatal stabbing of a German man, for which 2 immigrants were arrested. Chemnitz police said over 2,000 far-right protesters attended the march, with around 1,000 counter-demonstrators also taking to the streets. Hundreds of police officers were deployed in a bid to avoid a repeat of the violence seen when protests first broke out nearly 2 weeks ago. The far-right Alternative for Sweden held a rally in central Stockholm ahead of Sunday's general elections, in which the country is expected to lurch to the right. The party has repatriation at the top of its agenda and was officially launched earlier this year, partly by people expelled from the far-right Sweden Democrats for being too extreme. Neither of the main political blocs is likely to win a majority, given the Sweden Democrats have a key role in shaping the next government. Supporters of Bolsonaro are calling for a federal investigation into the attack after initial police reports emerged that the suspect in the crime suffered from mental illness and had acted alone. Suspect is being held in custody in the city of Juez de Fora and has been charged with violating the country's national security law, which details such politically motivated attacks as an act of terrorism. Reports suggest that the suspect confessed to committing the crime and faces up to 10 years in prison. Many tourists are stranded at the new Chitose airport in northern Japan's Sapporo city after a preliminary magnitude 6.7 earthquake rocked Hokkaido Island. The new Chitose airport was temporarily closed after the quake and was only gradually resuming domestic flights on Friday after power was restored. International flights remain suspended. Yet, with most hotels in Hokkaido closed due to a lack of water and electricity, many international tourists opted to wait in the airport until their flights departed. Alibaba co-founder and chief Jack Ma has announced retirement. Jack Ma has said that he will be leaving the Chinese e-commerce giant on Monday to devote his time for philanthropic focused on education. Jack Ma was an English teacher before starting Alibaba in 1999 and built it into a multi-billion-dollar internet colossus. UK's flagship carrier, British Airways, has been hit by another embarrassing breach. In a massive data breach, transaction details of more than 380,000 customers has been stolen. British Airways officials revealed that hackers targeted people using their website and mobile app for bookings between 21st of August and 5th of September. French President Emmanuel Macron met with German Chancellor Angela Merkel at the Pharaoh Palace in the French town of Marseille to discuss the challenges faced by the European Union. In a joint statement ahead of the meeting, Macron and Merkel said they would cover a range of issues such as Brexit, migratory policies, and the development of the economic and monetary union and the banking union. Brexit remained a top concern as the United Kingdom is due to leave the European Union on March 29th. Though little is clear and there is so far no full exit deal. U.S. Defense Secretary Jim Mattis met Afghan President Ashraf Ghani during an unannounced visit to Kabul to discuss prospects for peace talks with Taliban and the country's worsening security situation ahead of the upcoming elections. Mattis was accompanied by Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Marine General Joseph Dunford, who earlier in the week had gone to Islamabad with Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. The officials met with President Ghani at his presidential palace to discuss progress to end the 17-year-old war, which has become America's longest conflict. Belgian brewers, accompanied by musicians dressed in medieval costumes, took a barrel of beer to Brussels Cathedral for consecration as part of an annual celebration of their patron saint Arnold, known as the knighthood of the brewers' paddle. The Guild of Brewers walked to music through Brussels' historic Grand Palace to the cathedral for the ceremony, where the wooden cask of beer was blessed by a priest. Belgian monks began brewing more than 1,000 years ago and are currently more than 150 breweries making beers ranging from strong Trappist brews to fruit ales.
Met de vlag achteraan. En toorten bovenaan, al de andere komen erbij.